Welcome everyone to another Berkeley Tech event this semester. Marion Fourcade, I'm the Director of Social Science Matrix. It is my great pleasure to introduce Janet Vertesi. Janet is Professor of Sociology Associate Professor of Sociology and Science Ethnology at Princeton University, where she's also the Associate Director of the Keller Center for Innovation in Engineering Education. Now, Janet is one of the most original and generative scholars working today at the intersection of science and technology studies and the study of organizations. And what makes her so special, such a rare bird among sociologists, is her extraordinary 20-plus-year-long ethnography inside NASA. This is sort of this very uniquely immersive research that has led actually the Times Literary Supplement to dub her the Margaret Mead among the Starfleet. And it has so far yielded 2 books, Seeing Like a Rover, on how the Mars rover team produced and made sense of scientific images, and Shaping Science, which follows the Cassini probe mission orbiting Saturn to ask how organizational structure shapes scientific practice. And now there's a third NASA book forthcoming, The Cost of Crisis, which we heard about in sociology earlier this week, and which is about how NASA has responded to repeated waves of funding retrenchment. But of course, many of you also know Janet for other reasons. Her reach actually extends beyond deep space. She's been, if that's possible, she's been a driving force in building digital STS as an emerging field. She's made really influential contributions on data ethics, AI fairness, and one of my favorite, the moral economies of personal data. And so today's talk grows out of that second stream of research, and she asked what it actually takes practically, ethically, existentially to live life of the surveillance capitalism orbit, right? The eye of Sauron. So I give you Janet Vertesi and the Opt-out Project. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'll just do a quick mic check. Can you hear me? We're all good. Awesome. So yeah, it's kind of a little unusual talk for me to give. Usually I'd be standing here telling you about my work at NASA and all the ethnographic, methods that I followed. But today I'm going to be talking about a different project, and it's kind of a lifelong project. It's certainly followed me for the last 14 years. It's premised in my academic work and my academic understanding, but it's largely autobiographical. You'll find it is whimsical and zany at times, but hopefully no less compelling. And what I'm going to do today is give you some ideas of powerful techniques that I've developed, but I think we can all use to fight against surveillance capitalism, and also why this is the kind of work that we must do and must do now. So when we think about that moment when the internet changed, some of us think about Elon carrying a sink into Twitter. Some of us think about that moment when we learned about Cambridge Analytica and what happened during Brexit. We think about 2022 or 2016. But for me, I want to take you back to 2012 and a very cold January day in New York when I got on the subway and I looked up and I saw these ads from Google. And this was crazy. Google was a search firm. It was an internet thing. It only existed on the internet. You didn't see ads for Google. And this was an ad for Google that was advertising that it cared about your privacy, but what it was really saying is, we're making a privacy policy change, and beginning March 1st, 2012, you will have to agree to this change to continue to use Google products. And what was the change? This was the first time when Google said, we will amalgamate your data across all of our products and services to begin what became basically the platform economy. Before then, there were search firms, there were many different internet firms, so this is the beginning of the big data rush. This was the beginning of the platform economy. This was the beginning of many of the moments that we've seen since then. And what was important for me, come on in, is that at the time I had been attending meetings at the Center for Information Technology Policy at Princeton, the President's Council on Big Data. Dana Boyd was starting the Data and Society Institute. There were meetings at Microsoft. There were meetings at Chi. We were talking about big data. We knew a lot about this phenomenon. We knew And we told them that there would be problems with privacy, with bias, with targeting, with all kinds of issues that we have since seen come true. This was not unintended consequences. It was not even uninformed decision-making, but it was poor decision-making on their part. And this was the moment when, like, my heart fell through the floor and I realized I had to break up with Google. So it's probably no surprise to members of this room that we're now living in what has become more of a dystopian atmosphere with big tech, that we were told back in 1984 that this was the big IBM was the thing that the tech companies were there to break up. And yet, what have we seen since then? We've seen the rise of what is now called big tech, massive inequalities and oligarchy, racist, sexist, and discriminatory systems that amplify bias. I'm thinking here of the work of Safiya Noble or Ruha Benjamin or Virginia Eubanks. Systems that barely even work, that are rolled out across a workforce just to improve profit margin or to improve return on investment. Thinking here of the work of Ben Shostakofsky or Mona Sloan or Lucy Suchman on AI. And just getting something done sets off a whole series of cascading harms through precarious work and potentially damaging the economy. So many of these issues were foreseen, and they were, with warnings, were unheeded. And we have various different ideas in academia about, like, what we should do. Like, who's going to be this character now? Do we need better regulation to rein the companies in? I dare you to find regulation that'll work right now. But I'd love to hear it if there is some. Do we debias these algorithms? Do we spend time on the technologies themselves? Do we figure out how to talk about governance and privacy so we can sprinkle it on top of these misplaced systems like sprinkles on a donut or something and somehow change the character of the system? Or do we just need a lot of philosophers in the room because they will teach us practical ethics? You have probably heard many versions of these answers to this question. There are many fruitful lines of research along these lines. I don't mean to disparage any of that research, but I do mean to say that I decided to do something quite different, and perhaps a little rash. I decided, what if we tried something else entirely? What if we rejected those systems that were wrong-headed from the start? What if we threw them out and started over? What if I became the Marie Kondo of surveillance capitalism? What if, could I spark joy by tidying the big tech giants out of my digital life? And could I still live in a happy way online without having to deal with all of that, without having to participate in what was an economy that I noticed was going to lead us to ruin already, unfortunately, in 2012? So I actually come at this because I'd like to say I am a serious scholar. But I have worked with NASA for 20 years with robotic spacecraft teams as an ethnographer of science and technology. I'm also a critical design practitioner, and that means in human-computer interaction, what I do is identify the core assumptions that are built into a technology, flip them on their heads and say, what if we built it differently? Not just speculatively, but like, let's build it differently. Let's do it differently and see what happens. So this means that I publish at places like Chi and AltChi, as well as in sociology and in STS. And I'm currently leading the development of a responsible design program at Princeton. But it was also because of this scholarship that I realized it was time to do differently and that we could do differently. And in fact, we already were doing differently. So in my work with NASA, which is the original public tech organization, have you know, I was working among human-robot teams that were imbued with artificial intelligence, that were not taking our jobs, exploiting our data, generating slop. Like, they were there to help us do science. They were there to help us do exploration. They were threaded through with governance, from the very capital G governance, like congressional oversight over exactly how much money you're spending on this thing, to small g governance, which is like the groups of scientists and engineers got together every day to say, what's our robot doing? What data do we have? And what do we need it to do tomorrow? And how do we make that decision responsibly so the taxpayer gets the best bang for the buck and the best possible science? I also noticed that these robots inspired care and connection among their community. They weren't like super, super smart. They didn't have like AGI, but they were the kinds of things that people came together to work on something that was greater than themselves. It was a really inspiring opportunity. And they gave us these incredible experiences without personalization or ads. They last for decades. There's no genius bar on Mars. You can't like walk in and be like, oh, I need it. This isn't working. Can I get a new one? Like, no, it's out there. You have to make it work for 20 years. They're still talking to Voyagers in Fortran 77. And you can't, so that's what technical literacy is, keeping that alive, not having the coolest new thing, right? And you can't just make them do things in the cloud. There's no cloud on Mars. So everything is on the box. And that means you're thinking really carefully about what capabilities the robot is bringing to the room and what capabilities the people are bringing to the room. And that means that we are elevated in our work together in teams. So I had one foot in this kind of, it felt like a futuristic world at NASA. It felt like it really was going to be the future of work. That this is what it was going to look like when AI hit the workplace. Like, how wrong was I, right? It's now become a bizarre, footnote in history that this was a thing that we did once. But it was interesting because I also had this other foot in the room at CHI, in human-computer interaction, and at the Consumer Electronics Show, and sort of a general consumer tech, where I started to notice that the very things we told them were a problem were starting to get built into the systems around us. So I opted out. So I have a long series of opt-out experiments. I will talk about many of them today, but I'll talk about them in the context of what I learned from opting out of these systems, beginning with breaking up with Google in 2012, having a pregnancy and with multiple pregnancies that were entirely undetected by data brokers, building my own cell phone and experimenting with Linux on the phone. Yay, Linux on the phone. Resurrecting old smartwatches. There's a variety of these. I will go through these in more detail, and currently working on alternatives to AI, which get me really excited. But here's where, actually that thing where, can I have a hand up in the room? Have you ever had an ad show up on your phone or something, and you're like, well, that's kind of creepy. That's what I was just talking about a couple of... Everyone? Has anyone not? Awesome. Yes, thank you. Okay, yeah, I've never actually had that happen to me at all. And so I'm going to show you how I did that to make sure that it didn't happen. And also congrats to those in the room that are also managing to evade. So let me tell you, there's a lot of misconceptions about opting out, okay? So I'm not living in a cave. I don't live in a cave. Actually, my house is a Faraday cage, which is kind of interesting. I thought that was kind of cool. Prior owners put aluminum siding on it, and I was like, sweet, this is awesome. But I'm not otherwise living in a cave. I have a very thickly digital life. I spend a lot of time online, and I have a lot more microprocessors in my house than people easily, and I'm root on all of them. And it's also not done out of ignorance or fear. I was building computers when I was a little kid in the 80s. I learned to program in BASIC when I was 6 or 7, and I ran a bulletin board system in the 1990 bulletin board systems. They were so awesome. If you're into the 90s, you need a BBS. So it's not like I don't know what I'm doing around computers. And actually I found that when I started opting out, people would come up to me, they'd be like, well, I had a friend who worked at Google. He's like, yeah, I understand you don't use Google. Let me explain it to you, because maybe if you understand it, you'd like it. And I was like, actually, I think the problem is I do understand, but thanks. Now, the other two more serious issues are that, is this just an exit option democracy, which is not really a democracy? And when we think about voice and governance in organizations, the exit option is if you don't like it, you just leave. You have no voice to make a change. Now, I think many of us who have worked in or adjacent to the tech industry have realized that our voices are not necessarily welcome if they're not aligned with what the main undercurrent of the organization is. But my issue here was not to not have a voice. My issue was to have a voice somewhere else. And then I also get a lot of, well, this is kind of like that consumer choice thing where we're going to be more environmentally friendly because you bought a good lunch bag or something, And that's not what I'm doing here either. And I'll get into why I think this goes far beyond consumer choice into more building alternatives. Oops. Yeah. What opting out is a form of protest. It's a neo-Luddite protest in which resistance is about throwing monkey wrenches into the gears of the personal data economy as I leave. It is also, for those sociologists familiar with ethnomethodology, which is a tongue twister, it's something of a breaching experiment. That is, when you go against social norms, then you really see clearly what those norms are and how people want you to behave. And so that's really powerful for me with respect to technologies, because it helps me identify ways to fight back. And it's also what Jeff Bowker called an infrastructural inversion, which is when you kind of dig deep below the infrastructure to figure out what are the assumptions that animate it. And then for me, I can use that to resist and develop counter strategies and tools. So I actually kind of geek out on what I learned from doing this. But it's also a very hopeful project In STS, we were told it could always have been otherwise. And I really believe that, and it still can. Many of the projects I work with were ideated long ago and left behind in the dust, but they represented a totally different way of threading us together. And that's the kind of thing I get excited about. And to that extent, it's a critical design project that's based on building alternatives and making those available in the world, and searching alternatives that do the material political economy of technology differently, that arrange the people and parts and labor and governance differently than what we've come to expect from the commercial tech realm. So in what follows, I'm going to tell you about these like sort of phases and also sort of themes in opting out that I've been able to reveal and also contend with in my course of my opt-out experiments. First of all, thinking about seamlessness, then countering convenience, and then redressing the concept of friends, liking with your friends. I can tell how I feel about that. I have feelings. Okay, so let's begin with seamlessness. And seamlessness is important because, first of all, it was proposed by Mark Weiser at Xerox PARC back in the 90s as the thing that was going to power ubiquitous computing of the future. And it also became essential to developing the platform economy because it was seamless connections between data sets and between objects and devices that were going to enable the transfer of data that would move behind our backs. And really here, I go back to that moment like 2010, 2011, 2012, when in the wake of the Great Recession, big data came to the rescue. The reason why we got so excited about big data, where did this go? Oh no, I think the elves don't like it that I'm talking about them. I'll stand still. But in the wake of the Great Recession, big data came in as the opportunity to build a data economy. So with the economy sort of in tatters, people moved over from Wall Street to Silicon Valley to begin investing in these companies. This was when they saw the rise of the programmer, for instance. Remember that when they all came over? They were so welcome. And really what it wasn't just that we had the new technical capabilities to do data management and data mining. We had an economic incentive to do it because this was what was going to undergird the next generation of the economy and ensure that we didn't have a crash in the tech sector like we had had in 2001. Now, at the time, all of the concerns we were raising were framed around things like privacy and bias. So Arvind Narayan and Latanya Sweeney talked about how easy it was to de-anonymize data sets, even if they were anonymous, because if you put them together and you triangulate, you can target somebody. I mean, we knew this ages ago. The 6 Provocations for Big Data by Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford already talked about how if you have biased data sets, because they're socially derived, so they're going to be biased, and you put those together, you end up compounding the bias instead of erasing it. We already knew that. And then Helen Nissenbaum talking about contextual integrity, where privacy and dignity is bound up and you transfer information in a certain bounded context. If you move that information to a different context, you've performed an essential violation. And then there were many, many stories about what happened, especially as the Nazis moved across Europe, where data that had been collected for benign or even pro-social purposes, where if you're born Jewish, that you could have a Jewish funeral from the state as opposed to a Catholic or a Protestant one, was ultimately used against those people. So we knew all of this was going to be a problem, but also in the background there was this economic crisis. And that's the moment in which Google had lost its head of AdWords, Sheryl Sandberg, who moved over to Facebook and started making money hand over fist with all the personal data people were just shoving into Facebook. There hadn't been a really good profit model for Facebook before that. Zuckerberg has said there would never be ads on Facebook, but suddenly coming in, you would be able to harness the data people were putting in the same way that Google was harnessing AdWords basically to create profit. This was the new profitable venture. So here's the thing, like, I'm an early adopter. I've always been an early adopter. I'm like very, very techie. I was well known for having the coolest and the latest and the greatest gadgets. I know what it's like to abandon a technology because you're like, I don't know, I don't use that anymore. I have something cooler. But what is it like to break up with a technology? Like, how do you set that technology that's still active, that's like all around you? Like, you're just basically signing up to permanently be the vegan in the steakhouse. Like always, right? So what do? And then the other thing is, like, what do you do when an intimate level of trust has been violated? Well, I mean, you dump them. You dump them, right? Fortunately, I had a lot of experience in my 20s with breaking up with people, and I decided to just draw on that as an opportunity to think about leaving something as intimate as Google. Like, I had Janet V at Gmail. Like, I had a top level, I mean, you can't do that anymore, right? I don't know who has it now. And I'd been on Google since it like came out. I had like just everything was there, right? I was just so online. But I knew from my girlfriends that if you're in a codependent relationship with someone really manipulative and you finally like, oh, that's it, I'm out, and you run out the door and you get halfway into the street and you're like, oh my God, I forgot my sweater. And then you go back in and they're like, well, here's your sweater. I'm so sorry, honey. Like, I promise I'll change, right? So I'd seen enough of this in my 20s to be like, I am not doing this with Google. So I made a plan. I made a plan for how I was going to take my data down so I wouldn't leave my sweater. So that meant I bought a Western Digital hard drive. I put it on the desk. And I started just downloading everything. And now they have a thing where you can download Google. They didn't have that in 2012. It was just me going through and like selecting all the mail on a page and downloading it. It was like finding out how to export calendars and contacts and everything and to save that locally. Unfortunately, my boyfriend at the time, is now my husband, was grandfathered into a hosting plan where we could actually start moving some email over and have our own hosted email. But it was really kind of a challenge to figure out how to retrieve that data so I wouldn't go back for the sweater. And then you don't jump out of the frying pan into the fire. You're not like, oh, I'm going to leave this one abusive lover to get into bed with that other one. So when people are like, well, what do you use instead of Google? I felt like they were asking, like, do you like Yahoo instead? Like, how about Microsoft? You're like, no, I don't want to be in bed with any of them. They're all building this platform economy. So instead, I just started to play the field. There was this new company called DuckDuckGo that started searching. I wrote about them. They sent me a shirt. It was very exciting. They were very small. No one knew who they were. But also, I just tried all kinds of different systems. I'll come back to this in a second. Like, I would search for maps on Bing, on OpenStreetMap, on Apple Maps, which was new at the time and getting a lot of flack because all the buildings were kind of smushed. But I still did it anyway because I wanted to spread the data out. I wanted to resist the platformization and the economization of that data. So I did that by distributing the data. And then you have to resist the lure back. So at the point where I downloaded everything and I was ready to go and I clicked like delete all the emails, and Google said, are you sure? We've shared 38,642 messages since 2004 or something. And I was like, oh my God, how could I do this to Google? Right? And then you shared all those moments. Then I was like, fine, it's just a machine. I'm just gonna, get rid of it. So I got rid of everything. I was like hyperventilating. And then they're like, you have no mail. Our servers are feeling unloved. And I was like, oh my God, I'm making them feel unloved, right? So, but this is kind of emotional manipulation that the systems would engage in. They also told me usefully that there's no limit to the number of times you can recycle an aluminum can because they're so environmentally responsible. They're exactly the kind of tech company I'd want to be in bed with. No, they're not. So actually, this was the point where like developing a tech breakup technique to actually boycott that technology over and over again whenever it came up, to be able to say, I'm not going to take the lure to go back. I'm going to try to develop an alternative. And I realized actually then is that when I was playing the field with all these different systems, Google was free, but it wasn't freedom. And it was more freedom to be like, what do I want to use today? What do I want to do today? So this also meant I had to spin up a lot of my own cloud infrastructure in 2012 when there wasn't really anything to do that was sort of generally available to individual people. So I sort of came up with a series of my own techniques that I'll share with you. The first I called data balkanization. That's that thing of spreading your traces far and wide. And you're doing that because you want to make it, you're like dividing and conquering across those platforms. You don't want anyone to be able to put that data back together again. So I would give things to like AOL and like, I don't know, Microsoft, because I knew like MSN Messenger and AOL Messenger and something else, those people hate each other with the fire of 1,000 suns. Like they're not good, that data isn't going to go back together again. Now it did mean that I spent a bunch of time on the websites that told you like which companies were for sale and who was looking for a buyer, because then that's when the data started to move behind your back. But in general, if you split your data up among hostile worlds, if you balkanize your data, it's much harder for that data to come back together again. And in the meanwhile, you've kind of thrown a monkey wrench into their gears, right? And then the other lesson I borrowed from NASA, and I was visiting Goddard Space Flight one day, and there was this looked like abandoned machine in the corner, and I asked my guide, like, what's that machine for? He's like, oh, that computer's job is just to call JPL once a day and send this one file. That's it. Because that's required in our contract. And then he looked at me, he's like, render to Caesar only the things which are Caesar's. Does anyone know this reference? Okay, it's a biblical parable in which people go up to Jesus and they're like, we like you, Jesus, but we're supposed to pay taxes. How do we let you know that we love you, but we'll also pay taxes? And he's like, look at who's on the coin. It's Caesar's head. So give Caesar the things that are Caesar's and give me your spiritual fealty. So I've done this kind of render to Caesar thing, which is basically a form of earmarking, of saying some organizations, some companies will get some data, but they will only get a little bit of data. They will only get the data that is about that thing. You'll notice I'm running this off a Mac laptop. My university still doesn't want me to run Linux on my work machine. So I run Linux at home, and I have an Apple ecosystem for work. And the only thing on there is for work. I have to use Outlook for email, only for work. But Outlook doesn't have to know everything. It doesn't have to be everything for me. Believe me, I have about 1 billion other email addresses that are doing that work because I've balkanized my data streams. So this helps you when you're not always in control of what you have to use. You have to use something for work. You have to sign up for your kid's doctor's office. Just give them a different email. Just make sure that there's a computer whose job it is to do that, but it isn't your one computer that does everything, and they can't piece it back together again. And then one final point here, which is don't block the ads. I love seeing the ads. I really do, actually, because it's the only indication I have about what I think they might know about me. So I would block all kinds of stuff going out, but I never want to block coming back in because I want to know what they think they know, and I want to know why. I can make a pretty good guess as to why when I see an ad that looks a little more tailored than just, looks like you're in New Jersey. Would you like a New Jersey thing? So in going against the grain, this was really a breaching experiment where I started to expose what these underlying ideologies were that have been built into the systems, such that when I didn't use them, I looked like I was inexpert. So one was, I grew up in the era of information wants to be free. And it wasn't until I worked with the Cassini mission to Saturn that I learned what it meant to be responsible with your information. To say this doesn't have to move everywhere. Not everybody has to know everything. You only give data to your most trusted partners. And also I mentioned this concept of seamlessness, that the data should move. It should move seamlessly. You shouldn't even know where it is. That's going to power the next generation of experiences. But it also means that you've lost control of your data. You don't know where it's going and who's using it. And at the time, my student, Sarah Brain, who's now a professor at Stanford, was embedded at the LAPD where they were using a new tool called Palantir to do predictive policing, in which they were bringing in commercial data sets like pizza delivery, as well as government data sets to predict and surveil and detain. So I was already noticing the kind of devastating effects of these systems from seamfulness. So I decided to choose seamfulness, which comes from my colleague Matthew Chalmers. I've written a paper about this before about something separate, but it was a way to say I actually want to air gap these systems. I want seams because the seams patrol my autonomy. They don't let my data move where I don't see it. So those are some of the first major moves in opting out. But again, you look like you don't get it because you haven't figured out how to pair a device with a thing. And you're like, no, I actually don't want to pair that device with that thing. I don't want it to know that it's there. Okay, so then things really started to gather steam in 2013 when Edward Snowden came forward with the revelation that, in fact, all of these tech companies had a backdoor to the government. So everyone who was like, well, I'll give all my data to the tech companies, but not to the government, like whatever. You did. But also this is an era when the brick and mortar stores were really suffering because online commerce had really taken off. They'd really figured it out, and especially with the rise of Amazon and delivery logistics, people were getting snowed. So the in-person stores started to collect data through their loyalty card swipes, getting data scientists to come and work with them to identify patterns and so on. And that's when they started to go digital and also to sell those lists through data brokerage. And they would give you like a little discount at the till for doing it, but they were using your data in order to figure out how to track you or how to sell you more things. But we also learned that certain consumers' data is more valuable than others. So this is the time when the teenager was detected by Target as being pregnant before her father knew, based on her purchasing habits. And this is also when we started to see the rise of these incredible valuation tools like Marianne and Karen Healy write about, as well as predictive policing. So it's not just that we know what you're going to buy. We've decided we know if you're going to do pre-crime and if you should be eligible for a loan. But certainly this element of like the pregnant teen really struck me. And that was because I'd just gotten married and we wanted to start a family. And I remember sitting in the car on the way to New York to look for apartments. And my husband, my newlywed husband, was like, okay, so I know this is the thing we're going to try. When do you want to tell your mom? When do you want to tell your boss? When do you want to put it on Facebook? And I said, I never want to put it on Facebook. I just don't want Mark Zuckerberg to know that I'm pregnant. And he said, well, I think Zuck has like better things to do than look you up. I was like, yeah, but as soon as I'm a mom to the internet, that's it. I'm always going to be a mom to the internet. And my data will move in a way that I can't control. They will sell it because it will be so much more valuable to them to know who I am. And after all this time, getting off of Google, we even hand-coded our own wedding website so we wouldn't have to use a commercial one that would allow everyone to steal your email addresses and so on. So that's when we decided that we would try to have an entirely private pregnancy. The pregnancy experiment went viral after my first child was, actually 5 days before my first child was born, which was not the best timing. Actually, there's never a good timing to go viral, but I really wouldn't recommend it then. And this has become a really famous experiment because it's very, very hard to reproduce. I've had several friends try, and it's really difficult, largely because you have to manage what Marwick and Boyd talk about as relational privacy, and Karen Levy calls like relational big data. You're not the only one who knows. It's also your family members who are also going to out you. So there were a whole series of things that we did. We bought everything in cash that we could. So we took out copious amounts of cash from the ATMs all over New York, which was not at all suspicious. And then we wanted to buy this stroller. We had to buy it through Amazon. So we set up a dummy Amazon account that went through Tor with like an unusual, like a dummy email address that we also accessed through Tor. And we stuffed it with Amazon gift cards. And when my husband picked this up at the counter, he was like starting to sweat because Rite Aid we want to report you to the authorities if you have excessive gift card transactions. He's like, this is for my wife. Don't throw me in jail. And visited, Baby Center and so on through, which is like full of trackers through Tor. Actually, I think I wanted to claim the most creative use of Tor award that year. They still haven't given it to me. We'll see. But actually, one of the big things we did here, buying everything in cash was actually great because it meant that we were on Craigslist a lot. We would show up like at someone's house where they were giving us the cradle or whatever, and then we'd be like, we're having a baby, it's our first baby, and they'd be like, oh, we'll tell you all the things. So actually, it was a really great way to make connections. But the other thing we did that was interesting, we call them digital canaries in the coal mines, the data mines, which is that when you give your data away and if it moves, you won't know who did it. So we would plant special email addresses and special ways of spelling our address and our mailing address and our names, usually using a middle name field, to identify where we were giving that info to. And I remember when my eldest was about 2, my husband got really excited about this cool kids clothing store in Australia, and he bought something from them. And a few months later, we got a catalog, a kids catalog for something totally unrelated, but it had that address on it. So we knew exactly who sold it. And it turned out that that kids clothing store, they had recently relocated from like Melbourne to San Francisco. Clearly they'd had a few conversations about how much more valuable parental data is than selling kids clothes. And that's what had happened to that address. But we wouldn't otherwise have known. Right? And so it's like having the ads as feedback. The canaries are fantastic because then I know exactly, I've had only 3 breaches ever, and I know exactly where those came from. But it also meant that we had to silence our family. I mean, my uncle wrote me on Facebook to be like, oh, it's so lovely, you're going to be a mom. I think it's so wonderful, kids are great. And I unfriended him right away. And then I called him and was like, I'm super sorry, but like, don't put it on Facebook. He's like, but I didn't put it on your wall. And again, like no one was noticing that there was an entire data infrastructure that was there to grab that data. Now, this experiment is now in many people's syllabi. It's taught all over the place. It's kind of exciting. But actually, what most people don't know is that I didn't stop. Like they handed me the baby, and I had this baby, and then they came over and they handed me a worksheet where they're like, fill in all his information because we want to, this baby needs to be tracked. And I was like, well, this child is going to grow up in a world dictated by algorithmic valuation and actuarial tables. Whatever they do in their Google Classroom will be used to determine which kind of job they will get. How could I foreclose opportunities to this infant by subjecting them already to the algorithmic machine? So I filled in what was necessary for the Social Security card, and then have continued to obfuscate my children ever since. And so actually an interesting follow-up, couple of follow-ups. This includes, now that they're older, building their own computers, building offline gaming systems so they can still play video games, but they're not detectable to the internet. More recently, because everything was AI and impossible, we bought an encyclopedia set so that they're allowed to look anything up in the encyclopedia so they can get a sense of how knowledge is produced online and off. But then a couple of years ago, my kids wanted to go to Disneyland, and I took them, which was really exciting because it was like a whole next level data privacy challenge, right? Because like Disneyland, like they're there to get everything. Now, fortunately, if it's Disneyland as opposed to Disney World, they can't get everything. Disney World, you have to have like this tracker band on all the time. And when you get on the ride at like Small World, it's like, hello, Janet, how are things in New Jersey? And you're supposed to think that's not creepy, but charming, which I would never do. So I called a friend of mine who'd worked at Disney, and I was like, tell me about the data architectures. Tell me about like, does Disney Plus know that you've gone to the park? And is it like people who liked Moana would like this ride? Like what's going on there, right? So I painted my kids' faces with facial recognition thwarting makeup that was supposed to look like different Disney characters. They thought it was great. I thought it was just Disney characters. It was great. And I got a burner phone to put the app on and paid everything in cash. And it was like, I had the best time at Disneyland. But my husband was like, you're playing spy versus spy this whole day. I was like, ooh, look what I can do. But actually the key thing here is, this is, 10 years in or whatever it was realizing how we'd gone from like, it's inconvenient to buy things in cash to like this whole other game that I call microconveniences, where a company will set up like things that look convenient for you to do just to get you to give them your data. So, you need to have the app because then you can order food and then you can not stand in the line. And then hopefully your 5-year-old won't have a meltdown. But like, it's Disneyland, your 5-year-old is gonna have a meltdown. Like it's gonna happen, people. But it's like the idea that this could really avoid it, right? So there's kind of these lures or traps to get us to give away the data by promising us a thing that used to just be like a normal experience, but which is now a kind of premium form of experience that's only unlocked by means of the app. And so this is the kind of thing that I'm really keen on tracking, because when I see a microconvenience, I'm like, no, absolutely no, I will do anything to avoid you. If they really wanted to make things convenient for us, like how about like free childcare? That would be great. So there's kind of a duplicity in the idea that this is convenience, right? That you could purchase this convenience through your data when actually the real conveniences are missing. And in fact, the real conveniences are problematic because they're actually complicit with so many of the harms that we're seeing in these kinds of systems. Not only are they manufactured, and then they also manufacture high cost for resistance, but they also displace that valued labor somewhere else. It means that they're bringing in more low-cost workers, that they're bringing in more ghost work and distributing that to the periphery and to the sidelines where it's unsurveilled, or to more precarious labor. And additionally, the more we put our data into the pile, the more it helps them target other people. As a white woman living in the Northeast in New Jersey, what I do on the internet makes it so that a young black man in Atlanta doesn't see ads for college. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I feel like I could never participate in. So despite the fact that it was expensive, despite the fact that it's inconvenient, my goal is to try to make this more open for all and to unlock real conveniences, as opposed to thinking that these micro-conveniences are the way forward. But in all of this, with small children and so on, around this time, around 2014 or so, the big data companies discovered something, that we all have these little devices in our pocket. And that's where we're doing most of our stuff, and that's like really data leaky. And that's the place where we could do location tracking and so on. And so this is the moment when I decided to hack the most micro-convenient thing of all, which is the smartphone. This is the first smartphone I built, and it didn't work, but not for the reason you'd think. It actually totally worked technically. I found some instructions online to make a Raspberry Pi phone, so it has its little camera here, and it has like a place for putting a SIM card. I kind of figured, I used to build computers in the 90s, like how hard could it be to build a cell phone? Turns out it's actually not easy. But the thing that's the most not easy about it is when you walk into the AT&T store with a shoebox full of your phone, and you say, I'd like to get a SIM card, and they say, what's your IMEI number? And you're like, I don't have one because I'm so clever. They're like, yeah, no, ma'am, you don't get one phone. So what I then realized is actually, why did I think I needed something new? When actually I could have used something old. I could have used like those rovers that we've kept alive for like 10 years, and like the things that are out in the solar system. Maybe I could get something old enough that it would still work. It would connect, it would have an IMEI, it would go to the network, but it was too old to remember a data economy. Maybe I could do something like that. So this is when I got really nerdy about cell phones, and I continue to be very nerdy about phones, and I'm happy to talk to you about phones until you want me to stop. But let me tell you a little bit about some of these experiments. So the first one I found is this one, which is a Nokia N9, and it was developed just before Nokia got bought by Microsoft. And this phone won international awards. Its operating system was beautiful. It was Linux-based. It was all privacy, all in the box. It was absolutely spectacular, and Microsoft canned it as soon as they bought Nokia for the hardware. But I started using this phone, and I found an entire hobbyist community online who were keeping it alive. They had descripted the phone. They'd rewritten the firmware. And you could, like, not only did you get this phone, and when you press store, there was nothing there because there was no Nokia, but you could, like, update the phone and put on all these apps that were written by people all over the world who also thought that this smartphone was a really good idea, and couldn't we have more of these, please? And so I used this phone for many, many years. I still adore this phone. It won't work anymore. Now they've subsetted 3G, which is another story. But like, this was my first opportunity to say, what if I used something old? And what if I joined a community of care that made it continue to work? The ones up here, the one on the left is by the company that then these guys who built this phone went off and started their own company with the IP. They called themselves Sailfish. They're releasing a new phone in Finland right now. If you're interested, it's fantastic. It's all Linux all the way down. I had a student project where they used a bunch of Nexus 5s. So I hacked those and put Sailfish on one of them. The one in the middle is Ubuntu Touch, and the one on the right is from Mozilla when they had Fire phones. And my best friend went off to work at Mozilla, and he found a whole box full of Fire phones, and he's like, I know who to send this to. And it was like Christmas in New York getting these phones. But here's what I learned from this, right? First of all, newer isn't always better. Like, why do we think it is? When actually there was joy and connection and pleasure in getting these things to work, and a kind of like technical satisfaction of like, yeah, I figured it out, right? And that was more exciting than like iPhone 3GS, whatever 17 thing it is now. And also there's a whole bunch of care that comes from that maintenance. Just like the same way I'd watch those people work with robots on other planets, with them through thick and thin, even as they were broken or limping or whatever, there was a sense of care that came from me taking care of these phones that made me feel more connected to them. More connected than I'd ever been through like an iPhone, which is ironic, right? The whole point of the phone is to connect you. So I realized from these experiments that convenience, it's a misnomer. It's not about saving time at all. It's about introducing a new mode of alienation. It's about taking away from you that opportunity to exercise care and to feel like you have that connection, whether that's with your children and actually paying attention to them to help them not melt down in line. You know, maybe that could be a thing. Maybe we don't need to have a phone that would fix that for us. Maybe it's the fact that you're no longer asking people to do labor for you through these distributed platforms where they're underpaid. Or maybe it's the fact that you're offloading responsibility for governance to a corporation that is never going to take that on. But when we reclaim that labor, we reclaim our time, we reclaim meaning in that time, we reclaim joy, we reclaim connection. It's like the most exciting technology you could ever have, and it's like a 13-year-old phone, right? So what I've discovered here is that instead of conveniences, we should be seeking connections, and that there are ways to do that by seeking these technologies. So I'll just give you a quick sense of the last pillar here, which has to do with restoring relationships, which is going on at the same time. So you probably remember Cambridge Analytica, but there was this big transition around 2014, 2015, 2016 from personalized ads to personalized content. And what I started to see with my friends who were on like the normal web as opposed to me was that they were living in filter bubbles. They had no sense of what was happening outside. They were being kept entranced through autoplay and continuous scroll, which was invented for that purpose. Their friendship networks had been hijacked, but so was their attention, and so were their emotions. This is around the time that we learned that the only emotional relationship between having some kind of response and engagement online was through outrage. So we were basically engaging with these outrage machines. This is where persuasive design really came home to roost too. And I remember at Chi in 2007, we had all these conversations about, is it okay to build a phone that persuades you to behave differently? And all my colleagues were like, yeah, because we can get it to help you be more environmentally responsible. And some of us were like, this could be used for really nefarious ends. And they were like, no, it's all going to be great. Technology's awesome. So we started to see this kind of like people mining through continual enragement and engagement. And by 2015, I was like done. I was done with this, and I decided I wanted to get off Facebook. And I figured that would be super easy because like I'm the girl who broke up with Google, so I could totally break up with Facebook. I'd been on Facebook since 2005 because I was at the Ivies when it first rolled out. And I decided I'll just deactivate my account. But has anyone here tried to deactivate a Facebook account? Yeah, that's like some emotional manipulation right there. They're out there for you, right? They'll just be like, are you sure? Because this person will miss you. Here's a picture of you both tagged in it from 2008. Remember how long you've been on this platform? Oh, are you sure you want to go? Because so-and-so is really going to miss you and you're not going to. Okay, so then finally you're like, get out of here. And they give you a 2-week deactivation period. And in that period, I don't know if they still do this, but they used to send emails that would say, your best friend and 139 other of your connections posted on so-and-so's wall. Whoa, what news? ... And then if you click, it doesn't take you to the Facebook page. It logs you in immediately and says, oh, it looks like you have to start your deactivation all over again. So in those moments when that happened, I actually phoned my friend and I said, hey, I saw this and there's like 200 people commenting what's going on. And that's when my friend was able to say, oh, so-and-so passed away or this person got a promotion. And then I could write them a card and send it to them and say, I'm so sorry for your loss, or this is so great for your new role. But what I began to realize is that Facebook had basically inserted itself in my relationships as a toxic middleman. And it was manipulating those relationships, and it was manipulating me through those relationships. And trying to get rid of that toxic middleman allowed me to reclaim those relationships as well as my identity. So before leaving, I downloaded I wrote down actually a bunch of the email addresses and birthdays of friends, ways to contact them. I told them, hey, I'm getting off Facebook. And then in the moments when I really felt like I wanted to get on Facebook again, I looked at that list and I called a friend. Just phoned them and they were very surprised. And I was like, hi, I'm calling because I'm not on Facebook. I want to know what you're up to. I also made a list of all my hobbies that I felt like I didn't have time for anymore because I had a toddler. It turned out I actually had tons of time. Like every time I wanted to do Facebook, I just like played a Bach prelude or went for a run or like, you know, talk to a real human or something. And that made me feel more like me. So actually, without the middleman, I reclaimed my relationships and my sense of identity. It was incredibly powerful. However, I will tell you, if you go off Facebook, everyone will forget your birthday. And the first year that happened to me, I cried a lot. And then I made a calendar invite that repeated every year, and I sent it to all my friends I really cared about. I was like, hey, peoples, I expect to hear from you, and here's Janet's phone number. Here's how to get a hold of her. And now, ever since then, I get exactly what I want on my birthday. But let me tell you about another project which tried to also eviscerate that toxic middleman, which was through things like home automation and through movies and so on, of what my husband and I call digital homesteading, which is like the kind of classic homesteading idea. It's about access to tools, and it's about making sure that you participate in communities of people that are teaching you how to do differently. So this is like an attempt at like radical data ownership through roll your own internet. Over here on the left is a version of Plex running probably about 10 years ago that allowed us to serve our own media from within the house. So it looks just like Netflix, but it's on the box in the closet, basically. And you can access it from anywhere. This smartwatch is the Pebble smartwatch. I still have one of them. It's an original. This is from about 2011. And it's been re-scripted by a group online that call themselves the Rebel Alliance. Get it? Pebble Rebel. And they allow you to keep using your Pebble for years and years and years, but you also can participate. They have a Discord channel. They're talking about how to fix this watch up so it's more popular for current use. And if you ignore the Porg, under the Porg is my attempts at building virtual assistants in 2020, because it was the pandemic and everyone else was baking sourdough, and I figured that I would build my kids an Alexa at home. Or like a non-Alexa, because like there's no way there's going to be a portal to Jeff Bezos' living room from my house. But anyway, so this was an opportunity to participate with a bunch of different virtual communities that were trying to think about speech to text and how you would like create a virtual assistant that was entirely on the box. So what's cool about this is instead, like we tend to think that if you're doing radical data autonomy, you're like super individuated, and it's like this neoliberal moment where you've got to have all this expertise yourself. But actually, it's about joining a community, and it's about participating with people who also care about building something differently, and they have a governance structure, so you actually have a voice. You don't have to do that whole exit option thing. You can fork the code. You can have friends that like someone in England who helps make sure that my smartwatch talks to my very unique Linux phone. You can actually participate in this way that actually makes you feel more connected. So those are the main sort of premises that came out of my opt-out experiments and experiences. I will say that in 2024, in the summer, I went to China for work and experienced what it was like to not be able to opt out and to be surrounded by systems that looked shiny, but it was all authoritarianism under the hood. And I had a moment there, a sort of premonition, where I was like, this is where we could go so easily if only a few little slips were made. And I fear that we are headed very rapidly down that slippery slope now. We also see that techlash is achieving a fevered peak with, say, the neo-Luddites marching in New York with hats that say, "I am Ned Ludd," and smashing iPhones to save babies, or like iPads to save babies from having to look at iPads in restaurants, etc. We're seeing this in the resistance to AI, even places like this campus, in a kind of technological reclamation or nostalgia, and a lot of new alternative products, many of which were supported by the EU's Digital Sovereignty Initiative years ago when they brought in the GDPR and everyone said they would never innovate again. And now we have all kinds of tools that are amazing. Nextcloud makes it so easy to host your own stuff between like Proton or Anta, or there's a ton of fantastic resources out there that are incredibly user-friendly. And running Linux on a computer now, like on a laptop now, is like completely different than what it was in 2014 and so much easier. So we actually do have friends everywhere. But at the same time, my concern is that with the rise of these AI systems, we're now moving into a different phase where it's not like if you're not the consumer, you're not the customer, you're the product. Now we are the mine, and we are also the miners. It is our job through scrolling indefinitely to train these systems to take over more and more of the functions of daily life and also have alternative capabilities, for instance, in the military. So opting out now has a whole other valence as kind of a digital labor movement, an opportunity to reclaim your leisure, which has been converted into labor, in order to resist the formation of big tech. So I have talked to you today about these three different approaches: seamfulness, connection instead of convenience, and actual relationships instead of friends. And to do this through breaking up or through balkanizing or rendering to Caesar, through using digital canaries or evading microconveniences and going for older tech, and for evading the toxic middleman or even engaging in digital homesteading, which I gotta say is a ton of fun. It's like a kind of tinkering that never ends. Not everything works all the time, but that's the fun. And in pursuit of trying to get this message out more generally, a couple of years ago I started a blog called optoutproject.net. And last summer I started a nonprofit called the Tech Reclaimers. And the goal of Reclaimers, really, the Opt-Out Project will tell you the things that I've done and like how you can think your way through this and work through this. It also includes a 21-day cyber cleanse to reclaim all of your data, basically, and to take control of your digital life. But the Reclaimers, we started to be like the bike repair club for the internet. This is supposed to be like a peer-to-peer initiative, like teaching each other, because we don't all have these technical skills. I had to learn a lot of them myself. And being able to show them to each other is, I think, where we're going to find connection. So in final conclusion, not really because it's not ever ending, it's still going on, I want to claim that resistance is not futile, that when we depart, we must think sociotechnically about these strategies. It's not like there's one tech that will fix it all. We have to be thinking constantly about the gears in the machine, which are both human and machine. We have to stop thinking about what's at the interface or what the features are that are trying to grab our attention, and instead think about the material political arrangements behind the scenes as we seek alternatives, not only for us to use, but also in which to invest our time and our energy, because that's actually where the community comes from. And that ultimately opting out is opting in. It's opting into systems that connect us more thickly, systems that protect our autonomy and our voice, and that protect our communities. So with that, I'll welcome your thoughts and questions. Thanks. Thank you. We got a lot of them. Okay, right here. Go ahead. And then here and here. We have a microphone too. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the nice talk.
You're welcome.
As I was hearing your conversation, I have friends who live in Montana. They're worried about the big oppressive government.
Yeah.
They're hunkered down. They have weapons in case the government comes after them.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, I see some similarities with that perspective. Obviously, social media has a lot of harms. I'll definitely agree with you there. But shouldn't the tax of saying to resist or to cut off, but rather focus on individuals making good independent decisions. Like you said no to the Australian baby catalog or whatever that case may be.
Yeah.
You say no, and as as a parent and as a parent, instead of saying cut off, isn't it better to say, like, in Facebook, you can unfollow people. If you don't follow your friends, you don't get half the garbage, excuse my language.
Yeah.
So isn't it better to say, I go to a restaurant, I don't have to go to every restaurant that doesn't serve alcohol. I can go to a restaurant and not decide to get alcohol.
Yeah.
So isn't that a better choice to teach people or to influence society? Make independent decisions. Don't listen to all the podcasts.
So I appreciate that. I think it's important that we maintain some media literacy more generally, like to understand when we're being propagandized too, as opposed to when we're making decisions that are of our own free will. That said, I think what's interesting about the opting out is it was not for me about independent decision making, because I actually feel like the problem was we are getting too individuated. And that makes it harder to make these kinds of decisions. If you're the only vegan in your town, there will never be an option. But if there's 30% of your town are vegan or vegetarian, then you actually have some kind of a voice. So I think for me, the key is about finding and maintaining and growing these communities. And I think that's what's different than the kind of prepperdom. Prepperdom is like, I've got my bunker, I will talk to people on the internet about how to build the best bunker, but it's really going to be me against the world. And I think what I'm trying to do with the digital homesteading in particular and these kind of opt-out experiments, some of it are things that I can choose, some of it I have to know that I can't choose, but a lot of it is trying to build solidarity with other people to build the kinds of tools and possibilities into being that enable these decisions and possibilities. So I also have to recognize that, like, I'm fairly privileged as a Princeton professor. There are things that I can afford. Actually, I can't really afford. It has been an incredible strain on our wallets to afford this kind of thing, and many people can't. And for me, that means I have to make space. Like, if my individual decisions are out there, like, they have to be decisions that are making space for more people to opt out or to be obfuscated in some way. So yes, I agree that I think we need to teach people to be skeptical of the ideology. I think that just independently, it's very difficult to make totally independent decisions. But it's a provocative issue. Here and then there, yeah.
I want to mention two things to see how do they intersect with this program. Ralph Nader doesn't have a credit card, has never had a credit card.
Oh, good for him.
So he has to make special arrangements to be able to fly.
Yes.
And to do a lot of other things in his life. But he's more than happy to manage to get through life without a credit card. And second is enshittification.
Yep.
How does this tie in with enshittification by having a slightly different sort of like consumer take on what's going on?
Yeah, okay, so the first one about Nader. So there's all kinds of people who do these various little forms of resistance. And I think Nader's a good example because you have to be quite elite to not have a credit card, ironically. I mean, like, if you didn't have a credit history, you can't buy a house unless you just show up with a lot of cash, right? So there's a bunch of elements that it makes it complicated to participate in society unless you can sort of get around it in other ways. So I think, like, it's again another really provocative example of someone who, like, opted out of the system, but it doesn't really make space for other people to opt out there. Unless you can create things like, I did grad school in Ithaca, where they have Ithaca dollars, like they have their own currency, right? And I think for some people, the Bitcoin is an opportunity also to opt out of certain other kinds of currencies and financial instruments. So it's provocative. I see a lot of connections there. I think it's also, that would be a hard one to do, but I approve of him doing it. In terms of enshittification, yeah, of course, I've known Corey for years. We've talked about this project before. I think where I see, as a sociologist who's trained also in technology and society and economic sociology, I see enshittification not at the level of the product. It has to do with the economic arrangements behind the product. So if you look at, say, this great book by Ben Shostakowski that I will, like, trumpet to the end of time about, like, the production of an AI system under the conditions of venture capital, the requirement in order to become a billion-dollar unicorn is to, like, not have any technology there. You have to just constantly be demonstrating growth, which means that in this case, the developers were too busy, hiring more developers to do the developing, so they had to hire people in the Philippines to pretend to be the AI, and people in Nevada to answer the phones when people were like, wait, this is unusable as a system. So I see enshittification coming about as a result of promises to shareholders and not necessarily to customers or consumers. But what's interesting for me about some of these alternative projects is some of them are capitalist projects. I mean, Jola, like, they started a company. It's a small company. They have a small number of shareholders, but their fundamental mission is not to sell your data. Their fundamental mission is to make sure that you have your data where you want it. So for me, it's like, what is the political economic relationship behind the scenes? Because that's going to tell me something about whether or not this product is going to inshittify. And I think the alternative there, like for Corey, a lot of it comes down to we got to hack. We got to hack these things. We have to resist these licensings, et cetera. And I'm thinking more about, I think of this also as a, I think that people can make a difference in the choices that they make for the technologies that they purchase or that they bring into their lives. So I do think that that's possible, but I think it's only meaningful if we're able to do it en masse as a social movement. And that I don't think consuming our way out of this isn't going to work. We're totally both aligned on that point. But I think producing or joining in on our way out of this will work. Good question. Yes. Hey.
Hey, great. So, I mean, I love the talk, really incisive and entertaining at the same time. It's very rare. All about friction maxing, of course. But I wonder, so for me, in a way, I'm going to ask you, like, what's the next slide after this that I felt like you were kind of leading up to, right? Which is the, like, how do you scale this up from an ethos to a kind of politics of refusal, right? Like, what's that what are the lessons here around everything you've been experimenting with and learning? What are the lessons for like systems or infrastructures of, again, a kind of politics of refusal?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the big lessons for me, first of all, this is really hard to do. It takes a lot of guts to do this and gumption, and also telling everyone to get lost when they want to send you a Google thing, and it's exhausting and it's expensive, and we can't expect that everybody can do this. That said, that doesn't mean we should give up. I actually think the way forward is a social movement. I think the way forward is more of us teaching each other these alternatives or moving to alternative tools. I think alternative forms of funding are key. So the kind of venture-backed corporation as a model for the development of technology has proven to be technically and morally bankrupt. I mean, it doesn't work. You're just vaporwaring your way everywhere, as opposed to these opportunities for actual care. And I think for me, it comes down to the reason why I started Reclaimers was I realized you can't do any of this alone. You really can't. And the more people are joining in, regardless of your level of technical skill, you'll actually pick it up. It's quite surprising. But also, they just want people who use the product and can report in and be like, hey, I used this thing and I got an error. And they're like, oh, cool, I'll fix that. Right? That's a form of connection that we don't have when we're interacting with these big faceless corporations. So I wish I had like the really big takeaway, but I think the really big takeaway is we can break up big tech ourselves. We don't need to wait for government to do it for us. When we balkanize the data, when we reclaim our data, when we switch to technologies that are not feeding a corporate beast or returning on investment on a bottom line on a spreadsheet, but are returning on our investment, our personal investment, and our care and our attention, we'll live not only happier and better and more fulfilling technical and social lives, but we'll be able to sort of break down what the oligarchs have done and what these big tech companies have done. So perhaps that's my big politics, is that we can do it from below, like the refusal from below, and as if it's not individuated, if it's collective, then that's, I think, the way to bring down big tech. But I'm happy to talk with you more about that further. Yeah. Another point, yes. And if you're taking away something different from the talk and you want to tell me that, I'm happy to hear that too. Yeah.
Thanks. You know, maybe another way to pose the question of ethics and politics is to think about it not in terms of scale, yes, but also about what resistance means. As I listen to the talk,
Yeah.
I actually, as I hear it, I actually see an ambivalence about exit. And
Yes.
there's actually a way in which what you're offering is an ethics of working imperceptibly. You want to work imperceptibly with others so as to create a community and to create new ways of life that might not be in the terms that are given to us. But in doing so, this resistance, which I think has an ambivalent relation to exit, is one in which an otherwise is possible. But I suppose I want to ask a question about politics having to do with agonism.
Yes.
Which is, can we weaponize this as an actual weapon, as something that does harm to adversaries? And I don't mean just, you know, signing these sort of letters or, that kind of, I mean, actual real agonism and some kind of digital warfare. I mean, are there openings for that? And part of what has been disappointing to me in some of the sort of anarchist literature that I read is sort of an unwillingness to embrace agonism. And I'm not sort of charging you with that, but I'm just thinking about some of my other commitments, my own.
Yeah, I really like
so,
that.
yeah.
Thank you for that. It's a really great engagement. So you're right, I am kind of ambivalent about exit because I exit all the time, but then I fear it won't do anything, right? And it wasn't until I really realized that I had to be working with other people that we could actually build things that built towards change, and that the more of these projects I got involved in, the better situated we were to make those projects better for other people. Like, they're way more usable now. I mean, when I started using Sailfish, it was like, it didn't work very well. And now, because I'm part of this community, they're finally releasing a community phone again. And they've had like thousands and thousands of pre-orders because it's sort of part of a digital sovereignty movement in Europe now that they're able to take advantage of in a way that they couldn't have done if not for being in that community. So I think that's really important. In terms of the politics of agonism, so I think there's two things. One is that, like, for a long time, I really did think about this as like a break up big tech movement. I think now that we've already trained their models, we're in a little more trouble. But I still think if we took down all of our data, if we reclaimed our data from these companies, we are their money, we are their mine, and we are their miners. We are their product and we are their materials. So if we can withhold that from them, we are withholding the materials by means of which they are building the political economy that circulates around them. So I do actually fundamentally think that there is a powerful way then to take these companies down by reclaiming the data. And then additionally through forms of resistance to these various AI-based systems. And there we're going to also need a lot of help from legal scholars and so on in terms of the lawsuits that allow us to bring that data back home. But then in terms of a more agonistic approach to politics, like thinking through someone like Carl DeSalvo, right? Where it isn't necessarily about coming out and being like full of resistance and anarchistic. It's more about the fact that when you are in a political environment, people have different opinions, and there should be an opportunity for those differences of opinion, and that a really powerful civic commons has to allow for that kind of plurality of voices. And that's far more a kind of politics that I'd like to occupy, which is why I like these alternative systems, because they give voice to different visions of the world. And because they also have governance built in, like those rovers, right? That it's groups of people working together, deciding how we're going to decide about features, deciding how they're going to move forward, deciding how they're going to do that work. And so there's a kind of level of governance that's built directly in and is thought about and talked about really specifically, especially in open source communities, about trying to figure out what kind of politics we want to put into the world. So they're very, very conscientious about the politics they're building into systems, whereas some of the big tech or the corporate systems would like to be more sort of faceless about the politics or not really own up to the politics. So I guess when it comes down to agonism, on the one hand, I think there is a forceful way here to resist and to break up big tech, and I think the more of us do it, the better. If we had a day of digital resistance and none of us used our phones and none of us looked at Facebook or Instagram or anything, like, can you imagine if nobody looked at Instagram for a day, like, with the havoc that would wreak just down the way in like Menlo Park, right? I mean, I think that would be a really powerful form of protest. And I think we can do it. It's not so hard not to look at it. Like, it's actually okay. The world will not end if you don't look at it. So there's that I think is important. And then there's also like, what plural versions of the world can we bring into being? And how do we show care and governance and responsibility for those things? But does that address kind of your question? I hope so. I'm happy to talk about them. You want more?
No, I don't want more. I just...
He says disappointedly.
Well, it just seems to me that there's a way in which we think about politics and capital, where capital is extremely dynamic and adaptive and
yes.
to integrate and assimilate.
It shapeshifts, yeah.
And yet our model for politics requires such immense solidarity and sort of collective action, that the very forms in which these two things are standing in some kind of contrasted relation is profoundly asymmetric.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so there's a way in which, I don't know, it just...
Look, it's really hard. I mean, when I first started talking about this in 2012, people thought I was crazy. I was like, no, you guys, you don't understand what's coming. And they'd be like, well, that's, you know, Jen is a bit paranoid. And now that we're here, and I'm like, it might be too late now. And they're like, how did you do that? I'm like, well, it might be too late now. I hope it's not too late now. I'd like to still believe it's not too late. And that's where, like, you know, thinking about what would alternative AIs look like that are like community-based data centers that we collectively water and take care of and grow, as opposed to these enormous, you know, data-sucking places that are there to like take all of our data and take all of our resources. Can we imagine and then build the technologies that are community-driven, community-based, et cetera, that may stand as an alternative or as something powerful for a bottom-up form of governance? I think having those things in the world, even if they're building Skynet, is still going to be powerful, because if they're building Skynet, we're definitely going to want our own networks, like to talk to each other unpatrolled. Like we're definitely going to need that. So there's a form of resistance there that I think is powerful. I mean, I regret the fact that it is now late enough that people are now like, oh, hey, Janet, how did you do that? But I would also like to think that if more of us did it, I think we might have we stand a chance of building a kind of future that we would prefer to live in, and to produce an alternative to what's already underway. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
I was hoping,
yeah. Sorry. Oh, go ahead.
I was hoping you could just unpack a little bit what you mean by your data. So as I'm sitting here thinking about it, it's like, well, I myself don't have any data. In my kind of naive view, data is something that's produced by kind of interfacing with a sociotechnical system of some kind. So I have a passport number, a social security number, an email address. So I was just wondering if you could sort of specify what you mean by your data. And I think that helps kind of narrow in on the kind of normative harm that's done by the big tech companies by misappropriating your data. And I think the kind of conceptualization of what that data is and its relationship to the individual would be really helpful for sort of specifying the kind of normative harm that arises from the way in which tech companies interact with
I appreciate that.
Data.
Yeah. When I think of my data, so it was started off by being basically personal data traces. So my contacts, my photos, my phone numbers, the things that live on my phone as traces of the things that I have done, the traces of places that I've been, the traces of places I've been on the internet and in real life. So data streams that are, of course, produced through interaction with an environment with other people, but that accrue to me as materials that then are used to, especially in this context, to target or to profile in particular, to create sort of big categories or chunks of people that you can do different things to different kinds of people. So that to me is what I think about when I think about my data. Now there are other forms of data out there like passports and social security numbers, or the kinds of things that happen when we interact with big bureaucracies. And I guess, it's interesting because I'm an immigrant to the United States, so I was on a visa for a very, very long time. And so I was always like, no, I'm actually very transparent to the government. They have my fingerprints, they have everything. Like, I will give all the data to the government that the government wants, but I will not give it to Google. And it was very strange for Americans who always thought about it the other way around. They're like, well, that's weird, Canadian. But I think that for me, like there's certain things that you need bureaucratically to get done. And I actually don't mind that, like there's a bunch of my data, there's a bunch of data about me out there. It's just in places that you can't necessarily piece back together, right? Or you still seem kind of like you're not sure about what data means. But for me, I think it has to do with like a lot of the personal stuff, the traces of my life are in places that are not owned by large companies that then are able to piece that back together and target and detain either me or other people with that information, even though it is produced interactionally and doesn't always belong entirely personally as a neoliberal phenomenon. And I also want to say that like we shouldn't all have to be responsible for our data as like neoliberal citizens, right? I think that's really messed up. So I'd rather think about ways that we can be collectively governing the forms of data that we have or the kinds of things that are important. And that requires like really imaginative building that departs from this whole idea of the venture-backed corporation and the kind of tech that has to look like XYZ and builds more of the artificial intelligence that looks more like the stuff I saw on Mars, right? That is collective and governed and thoughtful and truth-oriented. So yeah, that's what I'd say. Okay, over here and then in the corner, yeah. Go ahead.
I'll just start talking.
Go ahead.
So I really appreciate this talk.
Oh, thanks.
I think especially the system of change that you outline here, which much more nuanced what I'm going to say, but kind of a combination of abstention, awareness, abstention, seeking an alternative through community. And I was curious if you see parts of society, fields that are out there where this process has gone full circle and succeeded. Mm-hmm. And what was coming to mind for me as you were discussing this was actually the food industry. Mm-hmm. And kind of packaged and processed foods. And we're in an interesting place right now where we've had over a century of companies selling us convenience through these highly unhealthy foods that disconnect us from our land and from the entire process of nurturing our bodies. And we're kind of in this really bizarre space right now where it's there is a backlash, it's politicized in all these fascinating ways. But people are kind of coming back, and it really took, a crisis. Like it took people dying and realizing the immense impacts it's had on our lives. And I think your project really, is a great I'm trying to find the right word, but it's like a light in the darkness of
thanks.
where we could go. I'm curious to get your take.
Yeah, I think I love that. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think a lot about like the cigarette industry, right, and the kind of agnotology that was produced by the big tobacco to make it impossible to regulate cigarettes until finally, like the bottom up and top down had to work together really concertedly to make that change. I think that's also where, like, as a sociologist, for me, I actually never feel like the individual action is entirely outrageous, because I know that social change comes from both top down and bottom up. You can have the best lawyers in the world, but if there's no one on the ground, you don't have a movement. If you have the best like movement on the ground, but you don't have anyone fighting for you, in government, then you also don't have change, right? We're seeing this with the environmental industry more generally, right? We're seeing these changes hit like the kinds of decisions that people are making, the kinds of choices they're making about what kinds of cars they might want to, buy, but also like what kinds of products are available for fast food. So I see these kinds of moments everywhere, and we always go through this like really dark period before the light. And I would like to make sure that we've sort of infrastructured or scaffolded these alternatives instead along the way. I'm very inspired also by Sally Wyatt has an old piece on how non-users matter. And she talks really clearly about like non-use as a form of resistance, or as a form, like if it's just ignorance, that's one thing, and we'd also have to accommodate that. But there's forms of resistance, and there's forms of really informed resistance, and that can also be part of the way that we build and imagine different sociotechnical systems. And so that's kind of a thing that I'm also quite inspired by, which is to say, okay, if we know that this is toxic, and we know it's toxic on like 50 different levels, I probably don't have to tell you, but you'll find your way to this movement through one of those domains. And then I want to show that by the work that we do together, we can make something different. And we can make a difference for technology. I mean, I find also like hanging out with some of the young Luddites, and they're like, they've thrown their phone in the Hudson and stuff, and it's great. And they want to reclaim a sort of way of living that they never had. But then to be able to say to them, actually, like tech it wasn't always like this. What you're mad at isn't the smartphone. It is like specific decisions that were made to hack you. I was there. I was there when they decided planned obsolescence and persuasion, when they funded that lab at Stanford to do persuasive design, when all those people came through symbolic systems and built like Instagram and Snapchat with the infinite scroll. Like, they hacked you. But like, I have a smartphone that doesn't hack me, and I love it. It's actually really great. I feel connected. I love the people that make it. And you can have a different relationship with technology. Let's not black box the thing that we were given through this like morally moribund system of producing tech that doesn't even work. Like the technology doesn't even work. We could actually be building other things that bring us together in more exciting and exalting kinds of ways. So yeah, thank you for that. It was a lot of, okay, over here.
Are you excited about the Facebook lawsuit in LA?
Which one?
The one where the kids committed suicide?
Yes.
That could be a big tobacco beginning, I think.
I am excited about a lot of these lawsuits as the beginning of the big tobacco backlash, yeah. And some of the stuff around Anthropic and the use of data, some of the stuff around whether or not you're responsible if your children are doing certain things on the internet. We know that Facebook did all these studies of like children and suicide and social media and so on. Now, I actually don't want to say that social media is necessarily causing a lot of these problems. Social media is intervening in a space that's like highly complicated and deeply problematic and making it worse. Instead of like, we could have built tools that made it better, or we could have redressed fundamental problems like general societal alienation. It's just kind of like offering, like being friends with people on Facebook is the ultimate microconvenience. You don't have to be real friends, and then if you're like a teenager and you have no real friends and just people on Facebook posting like, pictures all the time, like where does that leave you, right? We could be building things that reassemble society through strategic use of technologies that's reassembling social bonds, as opposed to breaking them or hacking our perceptions and our behaviors in order to produce these things that are really fundamentally flawed. So I think it's great. Bring it on. I don't want to say we don't want to have any law about technology anymore. I think we want all of that. We want all of these lawsuits to force a form of regulation. But we also need to show that you can live differently. Because you can. And actually, there's a lot of systems out there now that make it easy. Yeah, the Fediverse isn't there to keep you online all the time and sell you things. Over here and then over there. I wouldn't know how to do it. And then those are the last questions. Yeah, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely phenomenal.
Thanks.
If you'll allow a bit of a meta question, I'm reflecting on where this conversation is happening in a university. Oftentimes when you're faculty and you're talking about stuff with people in the room, you're talking about your research. You shared a lot that sounds really personal. I mean, you talked about your husband a lot in this talk.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts to share on what it's been like to talk about what is a personal project, obviously informed by all sorts of research and scholarship, but really a personal project in this sort of like researchy university setting.
Terrifying. Thank you for asking that question. I've been very worried about this, you know, because I've been doing this for years and I've really struggled to figure out how to talk about it. Because for me, it so obviously comes from a place of like knowing my STS and my critical design and my like tech and society stuff. And the things that are really obvious for me are not obvious for everybody else, obviously. And also it comes from really living in these different worlds. Like, and most people don't spend any time at NASA, so they don't know that it's possible to have this whole other life that's also really technical and expert and joyous. So, so yeah, I have found that very scary, and I don't like to talk about my family very much. I don't like to talk about my children, as you can tell, although my children play a big part of my life and a big part in the obfuscation experiments. Right? So, and they have learned how to obfuscate themselves very well. I'm very proud. But it's a strange thing to do. I kind of want to remind you all, I am a serious scholar. I have many publications. Like, please read my books. They're very heavily cited and things. There's like citations and stuff. And I tried to throw some of that in here to demonstrate where I'm coming from intellectually in building this portfolio, a set of projects. But it's a scary thing to do. It's a scary thing to do because like I don't do autoethnography. And I don't actually think this is an autoethnography. It's just so like, Janet Vertesi, here's your life, and now everyone wants to hear about it. So, so thank you for that. And that's also where I would value your feedback on what I should be doing with a talk like this, that I've given very few other places. And I do have workshop versions that I give with people where I teach them the principles of opting out, and we work through like various worksheets, and we get off certain systems, and we try something new, and we make, you know, intentions. But that's a workshop format. That's not a like, tell me the things about this. So I would love your thoughts on that. Thank you. I saw one more hand over there in the back, and thank you for that opportunity. Thanks. Last question, go for it.
Thank you. So I want to ask you about AI.
Oh, yeah.
This is a very interesting timing because I read an article this morning that was written by an AI scientist who basically had written a letter to everybody he loves saying, you know, if someone had written me this letter last year, I would have said they were crazy, but it is happening so big and so fast. And this is sort of what exponential growth looks like. These algorithms, these systems now are literally updating themselves. And there's this feedback loop that's pretty amazing and pretty crazy. And it's already come for my job. It's going to come for yours. Mm-hmm. And his advice was, and this was the part that I'm really struggling with, his advice is like, pay the $20 a month, use the most recent version, learn how to use it. And I'm, you know, I've got a son who's in college, and you know, a lot of his advice was for like young people in college right now. What should you do? So I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, and also to give you the feedback, since you're asking for feedback. Like, I'm a policy person and an artist, and not a technical person, and I have tried opting out of many things over the years. Like for 20 years, I didn't do the TSA. And I finally gave up a couple of years ago because I guess there were no lawyers up high like making it happen, and I finally just gave up. Mm-hmm. So there's like the little sand in the gears that we can all do, but for people who aren't technical, yeah, like it's a really heavy lift.
It is a heavy lift. So I appreciate that. So let me go back to this slide because I think it's important. I wrote the cyber cleanse for people who don't know anything about tech. So it starts from you don't know anything. You're just going to do one thing. And that first thing is changing Chrome to Firefox. Not because Firefox is like the greatest browser of all time, but because you are going to, it takes 5 minutes. It's incredibly straightforward. In fact, they have like import tools that like you just click a button and then you're fine. And then you have another browser. And for some people, that's enough. But for some people, it's like, oh, I did that. Maybe I could do the next thing. And so I think the key is not to, like, I'm not asking you all to put Linux on your phones tomorrow. Like, please don't. That'd be great, but also crazy. But like, you know, then people write me on the internet. They're like, I followed your cybercleanse and I just put Linux on my first computer and I'm so excited. And like, and I was the kind of person who didn't know my way around any of those things before. So I think on the one hand, there's some of these new tools are so much easier than we think they are to switch to. And just having one or two little wins makes you be like, oh, I could do this too. I'm like, I don't code. I hate coding. I really like system administration, but I really don't like coding. But that's why I'm friends with people on the internet who are coders. And also, it turns out I'm a really great bug finder, which means that if you give me a, like software, I'll break it. And I'll just be like, oops, maybe did I do something wrong? And it turns out, actually, no, I'm just a great bug finder. So I get on the forums, I'm like, I did this thing. And they're like, oh, thank you for finding that. You know, we'll fix it. So there's actually all kinds of ways you can participate that aren't coding. So, and that aren't even necessarily deeply technical. And sometimes they just want more users because then they have a base of people that they know that they're serving. So I think there's lots of different ways to participate. But I also hear you on the, like, at a certain point you're exhausted and you're just like, okay, I'll click on this, you know? And like I got on LinkedIn this year because I became in charge of this center and I figured I'm gonna need the network. This seems to be where everyone is. I downloaded a special browser just for it, so it's like completely balkanized from everything else. Can't see anything else on my machine. I only look at it in this particular machine. I only look at it for a very short period of time because I get so mad at it. It just makes me so angry to like pay attention to everybody else's like performance and posturing and imposter syndrome all the time. But like it's cool. I'd be like, yeah, I'm so excited. I gave this great talk in Berkeley. It was awesome. You know, like I can do that too. But like it's exhausting and frustrating. It reminds me of Clippy all the time. You know, it's just like, look like you're having a great day. Can I help you? You're like, oh God. So I think, you know, for me, I balkanize, and it's kind of a compartmentalizing thing. So I would say are you supposed to use the AI? Yes, it is growing at this, oh goodness, it's doing things we couldn't have imagined. How unimaginable that we should produce an ungovernable technology in a period in which we have resisted governance. How unimaginable. How surprising that we have built governable AIs. We have, I have lived with them. They have not taken my jobs. They're wonderful and inspiring. We could be doing this differently. So I would say, if you can, pull the plug. Like whatever, the machines need us. Like they can't plug themselves back in, so pull the plug. And if you can't pull the plug, if you really need it for work, then you load it in its own machine, maybe run it on the box so it's not training anything else. Maybe if you have to do Claude for work, whatever, like I have to use Outlook for work, cool beans, but it's just gonna be for this one thing and one thing over here, and that's it. That's all it's gonna know about me, and that's all I'm going to give Anthropic or Gemini, Google, or whoever else it is. I think on the box is really exciting with AI, like these models that you can run locally. I heard Enta today just came out with something that you can run locally. They have a great photo sharing platform, all data sovereign. It's fantastic coming out of Europe. So I think that's, you know, there are really great opportunities here. And actually to go back to this note about like, you know, that eventually it comes around and you see this change, we are seeing a massive sea change outside the United States of resistance to American tech. And because of that sovereign EU digital fund, there are now mature technologies that are available, some of which are run by small companies that are really excited to get more users, some of which are open source. There is a real excitement about open source AI models in places like India and in China. We are seeing alternatives. There is more out there than we know. So I would just like to encourage us to go out and find those, embrace those, try something new, and let's see what we can do to fight back. You're welcome. Thank you.